we don't necessarily invest in like the traditional bonds because the revenue from that is coming from interest, but instead we'll invest in what's called sukuk bonds, which are more international.
Welcome to the show. I'm Michael Johnston. Joining me today is Fahmin Fardous. She is a financial planner at Zenith Wealth Partners. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure.
So there's a lot. You have an interesting background and an interesting area of focus. There's a lot I want to dive into. I want to start with this idea of values-aligned investing. Can you start at a high level for folks who aren't familiar with that concept? What is values-aligned investing and how does it incorporate into your practice?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking. So values aligned investing really it goes back to, really truly your values, right? So when it comes to you investing, you might say, yeah, the S&P 500 is doing great, but I want to make sure my investments are staying more diverse. Like, for example, there are some women who might say, I want to invest towards women empowerment or supporting minorities or, having strong racial diversity. So going into that is where like the values aligned investing comes in.
Got it. And I imagine there's a lot of different flavors of that too. For example, some people may have objections to cigarettes or pornography, or there's various different things, right? Are those kind of different flavors of this bigger concept, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, some people are like, I really care about clean water. Some people are like, I really care about, clean air or pollution. But then there's another factor of it for specifically geared towards Muslims, which is like along the lines of halal investing. So halal investing really, I mean, what does halal mean? Let's start with that. It means like permissible. So halal is anything that's permissible. But for Muslims, what's not permissible is interest or, being in industries such as like, as you mentioned, like alcohol, gambling, pornography, or even just interest in general. So that's when we talk about halal investments, that's kind of where we dive a little bit more in. Like, for example, we don't necessarily invest in like the traditional bonds because the revenue from that is coming from interest, but instead we'll invest in what's called sukuk bonds, which are more international, but they come from more of like a profit sharing model instead of just like, coming from a fixed income portion.
Got it. Interesting. So this seems pretty challenging, right? Like if you think about the S&P 500 or a global or an aggregate bond fund, I mean, a lot of these companies, they have arms in various things. It seems kind of challenging to exclude these things. So what's the approach for someone who says these are my values? How do you help them build a portfolio that is, I guess you've kind of got to hit two aims. You want to help them achieve their return objectives, but you also want to make sure that you're consistent with their values. So at a high level, what's your approach when a client comes to you and says, here are my values. Can you help me build a portfolio that's consistent with this?
Yeah, it's a great point. So one portion is like, there are clients who really want to ensure their investments are values aligned, but they're not Muslim, right? So that's like much easier to do because you
Okay.
can go through a screening process. But then when they are like, yes, I want to make sure my investments are staying value aligned, but also making sure that, it's staying compliant, being a Muslim, that's when we have to kind of go into like a percentage mode where like, for example, like a company like Apple is, it's compliant for the most part, but then like they do have like a portion where, they do have debt, right? Where they are getting some revenue from interest, but then they also have like Apple Music, which is not necessarily compliant. So that's where we go into a percentage where up to 30% is allowed. So like 70% or more of the business has to be compliant. So they cannot have more than 30% coming in from interest revenue, or a company cannot have more than 30% debt overall. Because also looking back from an Islamic perspective, it's also like companies that have less debt will tend to be able to stay more solvent in a more financial downturn position versus and be able to face the volatility that might come along.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point that there's in addition to a kind of a values aligned perspective of it, you can make the argument that these companies are better positioned for long-term financial success. Do you see an increase in values aligned investing? Is this something that is becoming more and more popular? People are in a, I've heard the term like you kind of vote with your wallet, right? Or you invest in the companies who have values that align with your own, or the alternative of that, don't invest in companies whose missions you are offended by or don't believe in or inconsistent with your values. Is this becoming more and more popular? Is this something that is on the rise?
Yeah, yeah, we see it more and more. And another thing people, I think, always kind of struggled with is that they felt like, oh, you have to have tons of money in order to
Hmm.
make sure your money is staying aligned with your values. And that's not necessarily the case so much, especially at a firm like Zenith, where we don't necessarily have any minimums. So we actually can cater and tailor our clients' investments in a way where they feel like they're making a difference, where and they don't have to sacrifice returns in order to stay aligned with their values overall. So it is definitely on the rise, and when more and more people are finding out that this is an available option, so many more people are like, yeah, for sure, I want to do this. Of course, I don't want my money going into like making weapons, or
Yeah.
I want to make sure that like fossil fuels aren't part of my portfolio, and but they also don't want to sacrifice returns, right? So it's
Right.
not like, oh, I don't want to have like 3% return just to stay aligned. So that's something that we've seen over time, and then it's really nice to see that we don't necessarily have to sacrifice returns in order to stay aligned with our values too.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Um, are I'm trying to think about how to phrase this question. Are people sometimes surprised at what's in their portfolio, or what's in like a broad-based index like the S&P 500, and how much of it, if they sit down and think about it, how much of it doesn't align with their values? I'm guessing that could be a pretty eye-opening analysis or conversation in some cases.
Yeah, yeah, it really is, especially when it comes to like, when we look at investments in like retirement accounts where there's not necessarily a lot of options, right? So they kind of only chose from the options that the employer gave them, and it wasn't like anything. And a lot of
Yeah.
people, a lot of our clients will come and say, "Oh, I don't know what I was doing. I was just like looking, and I was just, on TikTok or on Instagram, or an
Yeah.
influencer said this." So when we do an analysis, they're like, oh my God, yes, I don't want to do this. I definitely want to make sure it's more aligned. Or, as they get older too, people feel like, they're in a better place where they can make more solvent decisions too.
Yeah. Yep. So I want to zoom out a little bit from the values aligned investing. You mentioned Zenith Wealth Partners, and I'm just reading the description here. It's described as disrupting the traditional wealth management approach. What do you mean by that? Why is this industry, I guess, ripe for disruption at this moment?
Yeah, great question. So, I myself have been in the industry for about 14 years, and I've seen the
Hmm.
segregation and gatekeeping. And what I mean by that is traditional wealth management is always operating via minimums, like whether it's
Yeah.
250,000 or 500,000 or a million. So, with my background, I come from where there was $1 million minimum. And that's something that I always kind of struggled with, because I was like, that's not, you should, in order to get good quality financial advice, it shouldn't have to be like, oh, you need to have a certain amount of dollars. So
Right.
at Zenith, we don't have any minimums. We meet our clients where they are in their financial journey. So that's something that's huge. And, that is why we're disrupting the industry, because, we don't necessarily have clients that are in, that have gray hairs, because now they've built up that $1 million, right? We've got some clients who are starting, right after college, where we have
Yeah.
some clients who are like, hey, I'm getting ready to retire and I just want to make sure I'm okay. So we've got a huge spectrum of clients.
Yeah. It's always struck me as a little bit inconsistent, or there's always seemed like an opportunity there to so many advisors focus on, like you said, the folks with gray hairs who are closer to the finish line of their career than the start. But it's really in those early years, the younger folks, like that's where the highest leverage decisions are, right? Like Albert Einstein said that compounding returns are the eighth wonder of the world. And if you can get to folks and start working with them in their 20s and their 30s when they're looking at having 40, 30, 25 years of compounding ahead of them potentially. Like making the right decisions then, it's pretty high impact, right? Am I thinking about that the right way?
Yeah, you absolutely are. And that's when, with our younger clients, one thing that the trend we've been seeing is that people want to travel.
Mm,
So, and of course, and they want to travel extravagantly, or, a large part of their budget really comes from that. So because they have time, we're able to see, oh, you don't necessarily have to go ahead and put a large sum of money away in order for you to be able to achieve your goals because you've got time on your hands. And which is something,
mhm.
they feel like, okay, I feel like I'm ticking off these boxes. I'm having fun now. I'm living life, but then I'm also making sure that, I'm going to be okay for retirement because, you can't take out a loan for that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, great point. I mean, I am thinking back just personally. I made a bunch of dumb money mistakes in my 20s, right? And I say this as someone who has a finance degree. I'm a CFA charter holder. Like I should have known better, but you just you don't. There's kind of a difference between what you learn in school and then kind of the real world of tax advantage investing and IRAs and 401ks and 403bs and kind of all those things. And it stings a little bit, like to be honest, because like you can't go back and fix it, right? Like I
Yeah.
can't go back to 2008 and max out my Roth IRA, right? Like that ship has sailed, like it's long sailed. It's not
Yeah.
even visible anymore. It's so far gone. So a lot of these mistakes that folks can make, maybe mistakes is not the right word, but these I guess acts of omission that you can make in your 20s, there's no way to go back and fix them, and you miss out potentially on a big amount of money. So and I guess it makes sense to me from a business perspective too, if you think about um, having clients who are in the accumulation phase of their life. And if you look at this as kind of a long-term thing, being with them for the long term seems to make sense intuitively to me.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why, we firmly believe good quality financial advice shouldn't be exclusive. It should be
Hmm.
inclusive, which
Yeah.
is why, being at Zenith is so wholesome because we see it from different perspectives. And most of our clients are first generation wealth accumulators.
Yeah.
So, they don't necessarily come from money. So, receiving that advice, right? Understanding tax advantaged accounts and just understanding what they have, the tools they have in their financial toolkit is so important. And a lot of people don't have that because, the traditional wealth management industry is so gate kept. So being able to offer that, that's really how we're coming in and disrupting the industry.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to dive a little bit more into that. I'm always fascinated by advisors who kind of specialize in, some folks work with nurses, some folks work with divorcees or whatever it may be. And you mentioned one of your specializations is first generation immigrants who are looking to build wealth. So, I mean, what attracted you to working with this demographic, and what are the challenges or maybe the opportunities that these people face?
Yeah, great question. So, it's kind of like I kind of fell into it because I'm an immigrant myself. So I'm a
Mm,
first generation immigrant. I came to the States when I was 8 years old from Bangladesh. So being an immigrant itself is a challenge because my parents couldn't guide me in a country they didn't know much about. So, I felt like I was a bit of an on an island, but I was also young enough to kind of understand quite a bit. But some people are not that lucky where they come when they're much older. And the biggest challenge and opportunity is really the fact that being from a third world country, the challenge is you don't have the same opportunities as your peers when you first kind of come to the States. But then the biggest opportunity is you're in this land of opportunity, right? So you've got like this open playbook that you can go by if you kind of keep chugging along. But then, the biggest disadvantage is you're here. The
sure.
disadvantage is you have to figure it out on your own because you don't really have a lot of guidance. So having someone that can relate to is something that I think would, really speak volumes because I wish I had that. There's a
Sure.
lot I kind of learned along the way. And because there was no one else to teach me. So having a financial advisor that someone can relate to is really something that going to make difference. And I hope someone can say like, hey, I'm glad for me and I met you, and you're telling me things I didn't know about. And So, even a young Michael, right? It's like, hey,
Yeah.
if someone would have told you, he thinks, just having someone to bounce off ideas off is even great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I alluded to the mistakes that I made as someone who has a finance degree and that background, and so I can imagine someone who is trying to do this in a second language or a third language or a fourth language in a lot of cases,
Yeah.
in addition to trying to figure out when you're moved to a new place, trying to figure out the culture and the customs is overwhelming enough before you get into all the technical jargon. We probably don't make it easy, right? With some of the names that we have for all these financial accounts.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
it's kind of its
definitely for
own.
sure. Yeah,
I,
but then,
I
it's funny, Michael, is being an immigrant kind of makes you an innately grateful person because you
sure.
reflect on like, what you saw and then what you have. But then, it's the same thing. The opportunities are different. Like, for example, like I didn't go to kindergarten, like that's not part of like the public school system in Bangladesh. So, but I was lucky enough when I came to the States, I grew up, in like an immigrant type of town where it was a small town in Michigan called Timtramck, and there were people from all over the world, like Yemen, Albania, Bosnia, Germany, Bangladesh, Pakistan. It was like a whole hodgepodge. So it was, and we all kind of like figured it out on our own in different ways.
Yeah. It's a great point about the innate gratitude that comes with it. I want to ask you a couple more questions about your background because it's very interesting. You have a master's in psychological studies. I don't think a lot of financial advisors can say that. Financial planners can say that. How has that background in psychology translated to the work that you do? I mean, I think of financial planners and advisors sometimes as a big part of what they do is psychology, right? So how is that background translated to your work with Zenith?
Well, thanks for asking. It is really interesting because, when I was in undergrad, I didn't know I wanted to be a financial planner, but I knew I wanted to work with people. I knew I wanted to help people.
Hmm.
So my major actually was political science because I thought I was going to be an attorney. I was like, I'm going to go to law school. And this was, right around the 2008 time. So all my professors were attorneys and they were like, this is a bad time. We don't need any more attorneys. Like, and so I got really discouraged and I was already at the bank. So I kind of just stayed in the financial field. But then I really realized I loved working with people, which
Yeah.
is what led me to get the my master's in psychological studies. But then I also realized like I really like working with people and I also understand money.
Yeah.
And so when I kind of figured it all out, I was like, okay, I'm going to be a certified financial planner because I can help people, I can work with people, and it's around money. And having that psychology degree really helps understand people's mindset, right? Where they come from, because everyone's in a different place and everyone has a different relationship with money.
Yeah. Yeah. We're our own, I say we investors, we are our own worst enemies sometimes. Like the list of literature is a mile long. You can look at Morningstar's Mind the Gap study is a great one that kind of
Yeah.
shows the disconnect between essentially we buy high and we sell low, kind of the opposite of what we should be doing. The behavioral traps and the psychological traps are real. So having someone with
Yeah, they
both
really
the
are.
experience and kind of the understanding of what's going on there, I think it's pretty important. Let
Thanks,
me ask you two more
Michael.
questions here. One, your biography mentions, should always ask you about your recent travel destination or maybe an upcoming travel destination. You mentioned travel a couple times here, both in something you enjoy and something that a lot of your clients enjoy. So what do you have for us? A recent destination, something coming up that you are excited about or that you enjoyed?
Yeah, it's funny you asked that. Actually, just earlier this week, I came back from Bangladesh. I went there after 21 years.
Wow.
So it was, I mean, it was a long, long trip.
Hmm.
But it was really nice because I have two little girls. So they visited for the first time, and
Wow.
I met family after such a long time. So it was definitely really special. And travel is something that I really enjoy. But you just also have to make sure that you're setting aside enough to make sure you're not going into debt trying to achieve these travel goals.
Right. Yep. Great point. And it sounds like you survived the flights with two little kids halfway
Oh
across the
my
world.
God.
So no small
Oh
feat.
my God. The no small fee. I'll tell you that. Like just alone, there's no direct flight there. So we had a few layovers and just on the plane, it's about 19 hours if you combine it all up. So it was brutal.
My last question for you, where can folks go if they want to learn more about you and more about Zenith?
But thanks for asking. So they can visit Zenith Wealth Partners and go to the About Us section to learn more about me. And of course, I have my LinkedIn. I have a pretty unique name, which is, if you search me, I'll be the first one. I've never met another Fahmin myself.
Wonderful. We will make sure that those links, even if it's easy to find, we'll put them in the show notes to this episode. So you don't even have to search. We'll have the links right there. You can just click on them. Fahmin, thanks for joining me. It was a great conversation. I appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It was a pleasure.